Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hi, I am Richard Christel. This is the Democracy That Delivers podcast at the Center for International Private Enterprise. I'm here today with Kristen Robinson of the Open Contracting Partnership.
Hi there. It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you. So today we're going to talk about open contracting, the role of open contracting against corruption, the role of open contracting in the business community, the advantages of it for the business community. We'll be talking about open contracting and the nexus between corruption, the private sector, and the advantages for the business community. So with that, Kristen, please tell us about yourself.
I'd love to. So I'm the head of advocacy at Open Contracting Partnership. We're the only organization that focuses exclusively on public procurement. My background is in all things tech and data related to democracy. And the reason I chose to come work for Open Contracting Partnership is that public procurement is a huge part of that. Most people don't realize that 1 in every 3 of their tax dollars is spent on a contract with a company. So it's probably, after your vote, the most direct relationship you have with your government. And what we're looking to do at the Open Contracting Partnership is open up data and information on that procurement process, starting with how those decisions are planned, straight through to how they are implemented, to make sure people develop a better ability to participate in how their money is spent and a lot more oversight and insight into how that money could be better used.
Fantastic. Thank you for joining us. It's a fascinating topic, and we're happy to discuss it. So, in a recent blog, you talked about the challenges facing procurement teams nowadays. They have issues with data confidentiality, data standards, and generally the sense of having to do more with less money, but still retain the highest quality. So, can you just expand a bit more on what are those challenges and how procurement teams are trying to adapt to them?
Of course. So taking a step back, when we think about procurement, we often think about process and we think about compliance, but it's also very much about people and power and where power lies and how decisions are made and who benefits from the money that's spent through procurement. So every procurement team on the planet has had to make a transition from paper-based systems where you didn't have a lot of transparency or ability to analyze information about how money was being spent to a digital system. So that's been a huge shift and a huge challenge, and it's not easy to get it right first time. So countries that have already begun collecting that data are starting to see where the gaps in their data are, the gaps in their systems. Countries that haven't yet digitized are only just starting to think about how to do that. So it's not enough to just collect data. More is not always more. You want to make sure you're getting the right data, the right information that's going to give you insights you need. We have to remember that this is a $13 trillion market globally. It's also government's number one corruption risk due to the level of discretion and how it touches everything from pencils for schools to building hospitals to disaster recovery and more. So we're really working with governments to try to improve those systems and the quality of data, and then bring in that public participation angle. And when we say public, we're talking about citizens, communities, but also business. Business is bidding for these contracts, and they can play a huge role in monitoring the market and the health of the market overall.
Okay, so with that then, so what are the benefits of open contracting for the business community? Surprisingly, the private sector is not a monolith. There are a multitude of different voices and opinions in every country's private sector. So in some countries that SIPE works in, though, we find ourselves between two constituencies, those being the entrenched elites who like the status quo without open contracting, and those who are democracy-minded entrepreneurs who are trying to work in a safe and open and competitive procurement environment. So can you touch on what exactly are those benefits to open contracting and what the role of SMEs, like small to medium-sized enterprises, have in advancing open contract reform in their country or their municipality?
Of course. So I would say, even incumbents who are winning contracts can benefit from more market intelligence on the public procurement market. There's a lot that can be done building business intelligence tools on top of open contracting data to forecast the market, to understand what government is going to need in the next year or 5-year horizons. If you're talking about something like infrastructure or hospitals, you need to plan pretty far in advance. I think ultimately it comes down to fairness, right? And government wants to provide the best value goods that they can for the money that they have. That's not always just the lowest price. So I think by having an open contracting market, you enable businesses a lot more insight on what's going on that market. And you also allow government to have much more clarity on the nature of the tenders that they're publishing, what criteria they're using, that allows them to look at different things as well, not just price, but also sustainability, carbon footprint, or perhaps they want to increase the number of women owned businesses winning contracts. And they can be really clear and upfront about all of these criteria from the beginning, which benefits business because then they know what they're working towards. From an SME standpoint, the challenge is usually that the procurement system and the process for submitting a bid is convoluted, complicated, long. If it's not digitized, that creates a lot of barriers. And unless you are a bigger business with a team of people who sits there and looks through all of the tenders and puts together the complicated bids, you probably can't spare the time and money and people to actually go after these contracts. The other thing we look at is working with governments in the planning phase to break down bigger tenders into what we call lots. So they're a little bit more approachable for an SME. So SMEs stand to gain, obviously, by having this money invested into their business and into, usually they tend to be local. Small upstarts are more likely to be owned by groups that maybe weren't normally in part of that entrenched elite. So you're diversifying your economy and your supply chain. You're more likely to be able to buy local things that are important policy goals for government. So that relationship and that conversation between suppliers of all sizes and government is critically important to making sure we have a healthy market that delivers economic growth in a way that's fair and transparent and making good use of taxpayer money.
So in the past, though, have there been any sort of barriers to getting SMEs to participate in open contracting?
Well, the biggest barrier, and there are a number of reports on, there's been studies that have been done where, for example, the number of bids received per call for tender increases by 12% for contracts above the publication thresholds. So we know that having more information increases the confidence of businesses in going after these contracts, because a number of studies have shown that companies think, well, we're not sure the procurement process is fair. We're not sure it's really all done on merit. So the more you can increase that confidence level, the more likely they are to bid. Another barrier, like I said, is time and process. So trying to simplify that process, trying to make sure that information that's repetitive, the company name, the company director, things that don't change every time you bid on a tender, asking for those on an ask us once principle or once a year principle really helps as well. And there are a number of governments, for example, right now, the UK, who are trying to roll out exactly that kind of system so that small suppliers aren't burdened with having to give the same information over and over.
So I'm wondering, would you be comfortable touching on a clear example of open contracting, like in the COVID pandemic? Because obviously there's been a lot of that having to procure all these medical supplies. So is there something you're comfortable talking about, like a success story, like a big win, like an example?
There aren't many success stories.
Oh, no.
About COVID. But I have scandals and things lessons learned from COVID, if you want to look at those.
Yeah, I'm trying to think where we could fit that in.
I have feedback from businesses on COVID, for example. If you want to, I can talk a bit about the UK and Kenya and businesses there and some of the issues they faced in COVID.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of how I can pitch this question then. So it would be, so you've talked about all the barriers, but could you give examples of where open contracting has gone wrong? Like in the past, in the COVID-19 pandemic, there were billions, trillions of dollars spent procuring medical supplies. So give an example where even when there's an open contracting system in place where it didn't go to plan.
So COVID really exposed all of the weaknesses across the public procurement system worldwide. And that was a really incredible series of market events and dynamics when everyone was trying to get the same goods and services at exactly the same time, and panic buying. It's like when you go to the store before a natural disaster and there's no water and there's no toilet paper. And what we were experiencing as everyday individuals, government was experiencing in real time as well. And that created different countries responded to that differently. Interestingly, if you look at the UK, although they have some open contracting data and they were working on reform, they chose to create a VIP lane where they prioritized suppliers and bids from suppliers who knew ministers, which in theory you think, okay, we want to fast track COVID procurement, but is using the criteria of knowing a politician really the way to do that? And there were a number of statements released, for example, by the British Medical Association and the Royal College of Nursing saying, why were we not consulted? And that's a situation where open contracting isn't just about the data. It's about when you have a health emergency, of course, you should be bringing in the right stakeholders. You should be bringing in your trusted suppliers that the NHS, National Health Service in the United Kingdom, already uses. You should be talking to medical professionals, because a lot of the goods and services procured during COVID, as we're finding now, is they're kind of combing through all of those contracts and how they went. A lot of products were bought from companies that didn't have the right licenses. They had falsified certificates for health standards. They were bought from companies that were created within a month or two of the pandemic. So that's a big red flag. And I've talked to small businesses in the UK who can supply medical grade goods who said, nobody called us. We tried so hard to get a hold of the government. We couldn't get a hold of anybody. And here we are in the Midlands, ready to supply masks, ready to supply syringes. And yet we're ordering things from overseas that aren't meeting the certification requirements. So that's a situation where you can see if your system isn't set up to work efficiently by default. My argument would be, if you have an efficient procurement system, you don't need a fast track or a VIP lane. You can just rely on your system to do what it's designed to do. Mm-hmm. That's why the UK is undertaking the procurement reform and overhaul that they're doing right now, and creating a single digital register and creating these tools and revised processes. We worked with the governments of both Lithuania and Ecuador, interestingly, who took a very different approach and decided, right, things are bad, we're just going to publish everything by default. We're not going to, some countries, they were very protective of sharing who their suppliers were and sharing that data. But Ecuador and Lithuania, they did completely opposite and said, we want to go into open contracting overdrive and just put it all out there. And they benefited from that. And that's not to say that every contract that they didn't have risks or that they didn't have corruption or fraud in the system. They did just like everyone else. The difference was that people in country were able to monitor what was going on. They were able to track red flags. They were able to flag and cancel contracts that were coming up as questionable and stop those procurements before they went through with them.
And so when you say they published everything, they published all the tenders, all the bids, all the information on the bids. Is that right?
As much as they could. Obviously, you're building you're kind of building the plane as it's taking off from the runway in that situation. So everything to the nth degree is probably not accurate, but as much as they could. Mm-hmm. And they made sure all of the contracts were published. There are countries, for example, who only published contracts with their domestic suppliers. They wouldn't publish where they were getting their supplies from overseas because they were afraid of other countries kind of looking at who they were getting their supplies from. There was very much a scarcity mentality for obvious reasons. But then that meant a lot of that data and information was behind closed doors and no one could track where it was coming from. And that's where you ended up finding some of your more egregious, shady suppliers because they were coming from far away and places that no one really understands who the suppliers are, where they're doing having time to do due diligence on them and who their real owners are and the rest of it.
So you touched on owners there. So what's the connection between company ownership and open contracting? We've often talked about beneficial ownership. And so how does that interact with open contracting?
It's very closely connected. It's critical for anything you want to do around conflicts of interests or managing due diligence and knowing your customer. In that sense, the same kind of KYC controls a bank would want to do, the government wants to do as well, except you're not knowing your customer, you're knowing your supplier. And I think there has been a lot more awareness of that recently with sanctions regimes and governments wanting to know, for example, when it comes to defense procurement, where those components are coming from. And there are national security reasons for that. But there's also a need to understand if you want to meet certain social goals like environmental sustainability or women-owned businesses as a part of your supply chain, if someone can just create a shell company and put the face of the company is a woman, but they create an offshore structure and an actual owner is a man, then people are getting around. They're exploiting those set-asides and those goals. So there are a number of reasons you would want to know, and you'd want to link those data sets. And we actually work with open ownership on making sure that their data standard is compatible with ours so that you can integrate those data sets and track that.
It's fascinating to hear the nexus between beneficial ownership and open contract. I mean, here you say it all makes sense, right? So going back to that blog we mentioned at the top, you said you were excited to work with UNCAC signatories to advance open contracting. Can you give a quick overview of what UNCAC is and the connection between open contracting?
Absolutely. So UNCAC is the UN Convention Against Corruption. It's the most widespread and important standard for anti-corruption good practice that we have in the world. There are many anti-corruption good practices and guides and global norms out there. You can see them at the G7, at the G20, and so on and so forth. But UNCAC is the one that has the highest number of signatories. It's global, and it has the UN weight behind it to say, this is what we need to do, folks. This is how we fight corruption globally. And we all know in this space that it's a transnational challenge. We can't do it. No one can do it alone. So at the recent UN General Assembly special session against corruption that was last summer, there was a political declaration, and we worked really hard to advocate that the states party to the convention push for higher standards on procurement transparency. And the reason for that is, at the time of the Convention Against Corruption's drafting and adoption 20 years ago, we didn't have the technology we have today. We didn't have the data we have today. We didn't have as much understanding of how technology was going to change the fight against corruption. So we wanted to make sure that that was included. And I'm delighted to say that it is. The need for open databases is recognized in there. Also, we felt that the existing focus on procurement transparency was very much focused on the contract itself. A lot of people focus on the tender, the bid, the contract. But actually, a lot of collusion and corruption risk happens in the planning phase before the tender is ever published for anyone to bid on. So we wanted to make sure that we were expanding the understanding of procurement transparency from this middle section of the procurement cycle to include planning and to also include implementation. As you can imagine, it's very possible to bid on a project to build a bridge, make a lot of promises about what that bridge is going to look like and how sturdy it's going to be. And then lo and behold, down the line, inferior materials are used, environmental codes aren't followed, communities aren't consulted, if the ones that are going to be impacted by the infrastructure, so on and so forth. All of these things can unfold in the actual implementation phase. It's delayed. We all know the notorious delays of public works. So the implementation of contracts is hugely critical because it's all well and good to have a beautiful, pretty, transparent, public, open contract. But if you don't actually get the bridge or the masks don't arrive, as happened far too frequently in the pandemic, you need to make sure that there's public participation and monitoring on that process. And coming back to your point about businesses, we also pushed in this special session to have the role of business and citizens and civil society and media recognized, because sometimes it's the competitors who know the most about the industry, who know that bridge wasn't built to spec more than the government would or your local citizen living in the area. So those were some of the things we pushed quite hard. And what we want to do now is work with the states parties to the UNCAC for the next conference of states parties happening in the US next November, December, to hopefully secure a resolution that takes all of the promises that and the higher bar we managed to set at the special session and translates it into a resolution strengthening the prevention work of the UNODC. That's our hope. And we think there's a lot of good arguments for it. If we prevent corruption in procurement, it's going to save us all time, money, pain, and heartache in everything from tracking laundered money to asset recovery and prosecutions. And if we can try to keep as much of that money that belongs to the public being spent in the public interest in the first place through technical assistance and support and better systems, we hope that will make everyone's lives easier down the chain of following the money.
Oh, thank you for that overview. I mean, in several points in the podcast thus far, you've mentioned sustainability, right? So sustainability, open contracting, and the implementation of the contracts. So what's the importance of sustainability in open contracting? And what is Open Contracting Partnership doing on sustainability?
Sustainability is a topic that's coming up for us more and more and more. I think we all know what it's like as a consumer to be concerned about where your products come from, how much plastic is in what I buy, what's the carbon footprint, is there modern slavery in the supply chain? You know, as consumers, we care about these things and we want to be able to go online, find easy ratings and reviews. We want to go on Amazon, compare products, compare reviews, these kinds of platforms. Well, government buying, if you're a government procurement officer, your experience trying to buy goods and services that meet your social goals is very different and it's a lot harder. So what we're trying to do is at the cutting edge of what's changing in procurement, work with professionals and experts, including from the sustainability and environment space, to understand what data should we be collecting, what indicators should we be looking for. It becomes very difficult between jurisdictions with different certifications and different requirements on sustainability, whether you're looking at responsible forestry or carbon footprint or plastics or food waste. I mean, sustainability is huge, right? So what we've done is worked on an initial open and sustainable public procurement guide. We don't claim it's the end all be all. It's very much a starting point in an evolving space. And part of what governments need to do is decide which goals they want to focus on first. It's very difficult to do it all of the time. And I think that's what I mean when I'm talking about the challenges facing procurement officers, because we ask them, for example, could you please build some new schools? And can you make sure that there's low carbon footprint? We're not using too much plastic. There's no modern slavery in the supply chain, no corruption, ideally employ local and women-owned businesses. You know, the list just becomes very, very long of the demands we're putting on them to increase the social value of that spending. So what we're trying to do with this sustainable public procurement guidance is start to chip away at a piece of that puzzle and understand, well, how do we collect data on this so that we can benchmark where we are? Because the truth is we don't even really know accurately government to government what is the carbon footprint of government spending. I think there are measures out there, but it's not easy. And then go from there to iteratively improve public spending to reach these kinds of goals. So I hope everyone will check it out. And also please send us feedback and thoughts and ideas, because it's going to take a big global effort, I think, to tackle this issue.
Well, thank you for that overview. And just to clarify to listeners, where can listeners learn more?
On our website, open-contracting.org, you will find case studies, links to our open sustainable public procurement guidance, and much, much more data tools and everything you need to get started. And of course, my contact details are on there. If you want to reach out and work together, we're always looking for partnerships and fresh ideas.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit sipe.org.